Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for The Leftovers Season 2, Episodes 1 through 4. This video is the first in a series of videos where I review episodes from Season 2 of The Leftovers, which I will do in batches. As I'm making this video, Episode 4 of Season 2 has just aired yesterday, so I will review the first 4 episodes of Season 2. I have to give a spoiler warning for Season 2. If you haven't seen all 4 episodes, you will not want to watch this video until such time as you have, otherwise things will be spoiled for you. So, I knew going into Season 2 of The Leftovers that it would be interesting as they were completely shifting the focus this year to a town in Texas where no departures occurred. What was interesting to hear is that Damon Lindelof explained in an interview that when they were making Season 1, they thought they never even occurred to them to do a Season 2. In fact, once they had completed Season 1 and HBO offered them a Season 2, they had even considered turning them down. But Lindelof explained that being offered a second season in television is a rare gift that they didn't just want to turn down. Apparently, Tom Perrotta's book, on which Season 1 was based, was meant to be a singular book, not a series of books. There was never meant to be any sequels, and they reached the end of the book material at the end of Season 1. So I found this really interesting, as it means all these mysteries people wanted resolved, such as the National Geographic magazine and Wayne's Magic Baby, these things were never meant to be resolved. Season 1 was meant to be standalone. But since they decided to do more seasons, that doesn't make me think they will address any of these mysteries. They'll just create more mysteries that will never be solved. And I'm okay with that. I made my peace with that, so I don't expect much in the way of resolutions going forward, and that's fine. As I said in my Season 1 review, this shows more about the character stories, so as long as these continue to be good, I'll continue to like the show. So first off, let me start with Episode 1, Axis Mundi. The first thing I gotta talk about right away is the new opening theme. When this first came on, I had to check if I was watching the right show, and then once I realized it was Leftovers, I thought, are they being serious here, or are they kind of just parodying themselves right now? I just thought it was way too silly. Like, I understood that they were trying to change the tone of the show to try to make it less dreary, and as I'm about to get into, I think they succeeded with flying colors. This theme song being the major exception, because it's just way too much. It's hard for me to take the show seriously with a theme song. It's just way too drastic of a change for what they had in Season 1. I think it's trying way too hard to let people know it's a different show now. So this gave me a real sinking feeling on how the rest of the show would go. It kind of reminded me of Star Trek Enterprise theme song. Although admittedly it's nowhere near as bad as that, it just gave me that same feeling of a song that was completely out of place for the show it's on. Also, I like how the chorus of the song is just like, let the mystery be. A bit of an obvious statement, isn't it? Anyway, so then the actual episode begins with this really long sequence with, I guess you'd call them prehistoric people or cavemen, where this woman gives birth outside of the cave, and this earthquake happens, and the cave that she was living in is buried in rocks. All the people that she lived with were all buried alive, so presumably dead. And then she goes out seeking food, and a snake crawls on her baby, and she tries to fend it off, but ends up being bitten in the process. She then slowly starts to die from the snake bite until she succumbs to her wounds, and another woman finds her just as she dies and takes her baby. Now, I didn't know at first whether to love this scene or to hate it. It seemed kind of cool and kind of way out of left field, but it reminded me a lot of the movie Tree of Life, and I hated that movie. I thought it was a pretentious pile of garbage. It also reminded me a bit of 2001: A Space Odyssey, and I'm not a huge fan of that movie either. At least for this episode, that opening scene didn't seem to have anything to do with anything else other early, then it had an earthquake, and there was an earthquake at the end of the episode. And of course, there are most likely a lot of metaphorical similarities. However, that's all I think it will be. It has some distant metaphorical meanings for what will happen in season 2, but I doubt it will directly be touched on ever again. So when I think of this scene, I think my final conclusion is Lindelof, keep it in your pants. I think this is an example of them going full Lindelof. I think it was just meant to be weird and metaphorical, and yeah, it was a tad pretentious. So in the end, I'm kind of so-so on it. So the rest of the episode followed the Murphys in the town of Miracle, named that way because there were no departures there, and now it's a tourist destination and a regulated park. I kind of realized early on that this episode would just be about the Murphys and it wouldn't really focus on any of the characters we knew from season 1, which I thought was a really bold choice, and I was a bit skeptical at first, but they really managed to pull it off. The Murphys were certainly an interesting bunch, and Miracle was a really interesting place. It was a massive change in tone from season 1, and I think it really worked. These were really interesting, well-rounded characters, but it started to get more interesting when John Murphy met an old childhood friend named Isaac who was making money on psychic palm readings, and there was this tense undertone to the scene, and you could see John getting together with his firefighter buddies, and then he encourages them to burn Isaac's house down to the ground, obviously thinking that he's a fraud. So John is very weary about people in Miracle trying to take advantage of other people by claiming the town has magical powers or anything like that. Now, there's been some discussion about John and his group of firefighters on whether or not they go around setting fires. I do think that they are actual firefighters who do put out fires, but they will also set them if necessary. But as you'll notice from this scene, it's abnormal for them to actually burn someone's house down, because when John first brought it up, the other guys were like, whoa, really? So I think normally they'd probably just set sort of small fires to scare people off. This was just John going to the extreme. And then we see our first season 1 returning character when the Murphys go to church and the Reverend announces he's taking a leave, and he introduces them to Matt Jamison, who is taking over while he's gone. Matt seems like he's about to say something miraculous happened to him and his wife, but then the Reverend cuts him off. John then asks Matt what he was going to say, but then Matt just brushes it off like it was nothing. This really gives an ominous quality to John, and in my eyes makes him a creepy character. After all, we just saw him burn some guy's house down, so it seems like he'd do nothing good to Matt if Matt had made some mystical claims. And that's why the Reverend was trying to cut him off. But apparently Matt took the hint, which is why he backed down. So then we see Kevin, Nora, Jill, and Wayne's baby that Tom left for them last season move in next door to the Murphys, and the Murphys invite them over for dinner. I also found that there were some creepy undertones to the Murphys' conversations with the Garveys. Every time they ask questions, it just made me have this bad feeling about John, like he was scoping Kevin out, seeing if he needs to burn his house down as well. John's just got this nice guy facade about him where he seems to be just being polite, but you feel there's actually calculating judgment there underneath the surface. I thought it was a brilliant characteristic and added an extra layer to the story, because these are characters we've been following for this whole episode, so we do get to know them and identify with them, but there's this underlining creepiness to them that makes things a lot more interesting. And then the episode ends with another earthquake, and John's daughter Evie and her friends go missing, which was an exciting way to end the episode. So my rating for Axis Mundi is a 9 excellent. Overall, I was really impressed with the episode. Funky theme songs and pretentious cave women notwithstanding, it was a difficult thing to pull off, suddenly switching the focus to show an entirely new family and making you just as invested in them as you were in the characters we already knew, and also keeping things really interesting, and they totally pulled it off, so I was really impressed. So next was episode 2, A Matter of Geography. In this episode, we do go back to the end of season 1 and follow up specifically on the characters of Kevin, Nora, and Jill to see what happened to them after the events of season 1. And this was exactly the follow-up to season 1 that I wanted. At first, I was kind of disappointed in episode 1 for not following up on this, but that was tossed aside when I realized how good that episode was, and this episode made it even better by giving me the follow-through I was looking for. It was so interesting to see how our characters got along in their new life. First, let me talk about Kevin, who is actually going through some tough times as he is still haunted by what he did to Patty and how he just buried her and tried to hide her death. So he decides to dig up her body and purposely get caught by the cops, but as soon as this happened, I knew that the cops would just laugh it off and not care. This was partly because I knew he'd be moving to Miracle, as we saw in episode 1, but also the way that the authorities treated the guilty remnant in season 1. Everyone despised them, and thus no one cared when one of them was killed, so I kind of knew that they would just let Kevin go. But of course, that doesn't change the fact that he's still haunted by what he did, so he spontaneously decides that the family should move out of Mapleton. However, it was also interesting that he saw his dad and he's doing okay, he's out of the mental institution and he's moving to Australia. He seemed to imply he was still hearing the voices, but he basically just ignores them now. That was an interesting piece of information, I felt, and an interesting place to take his character, which would appear to be off the show, at least for the time being. And then there's Nora, who's still haunted by losing her family in the departure. She tries to move on, looking after the baby and starting a new life with Kevin, but you can tell it still haunts her. That scene where she goes to sell her house to some scientists who want to study it because they think that geography played a part in the departures was a really fascinating scene. This, of course, would set the stage on why Nora would want to move to Miracle, as it's a place where no departures took place. So if it was a matter of geography, it would mean that they are safe there. But also the scientists would bring up the possibility of the departure occurring again, which would underline a huge fear that she has. And then there's Jill, who's probably made the most interesting character change, as she's completely turned herself around and is now more happy and cheery and isn't just mopey and like she was in season 1. I totally bought this character change, and I felt it made her character much more interesting. That scene that she had with Tom at the diner where he was obviously still down in the dirt and Jill tells him that she's okay was such a powerful callback to season 1, where she said no one was okay. But now Tom was saying it, and she's saying that she's okay. It was just such a powerful scene. So then we get to see the Garveys move to Miracle, and the lengths Nora will go to in order to move there, as she buys a house at an auction for $3 million, and it ends up being a dump. And we start to see a bit of Kevin's insanity as he starts seeing Patty, who's talking to him. So he starts to go a bit mad, and he ends up blowing up at Nora when the house starts falling apart. And I love Jill's reaction as she's just like, don't fuck this up. And she's such an interesting character now, is able to install some wisdom onto Kevin. And then we get that music, that classic Leftovers music, to punctuate the underlying eerie feeling that Nora and Kevin are feeling. It just gave me goosebumps. This was the classic Leftovers feeling, but totally different, new, more meaningful, and powerful. I felt like I was returning home to a place I've never been to. And then the episode ends with the revelation Kevin was at the bottom of the lake when the earthquake struck, and when it was drained of water, but he had no memory of how he got there. It was such an amazing and suspenseful ending. So my rating for A Matter of Geography is a 10 the best. All my fears of Season 2 were alleviated with this immensely powerful and interesting episode with a powerful underlining level of suspense that was everything I loved about Season 1, but interjected with a new level of intrigue that made me think Season 2 may end up being much better than Season 1. So next is episode 3, Off Ramp, the episode that goes back and shows us what happened to Lori and Tom. So when I first heard season 2 was taking us in a whole new direction, I was a bit hesitant about it because I felt they would make too drastic of a change and just forget about certain characters and storylines. 2 characters in particular I thought would be forgotten were Tom and Lori. So this episode alleviated those fears and made me realize season 2, although totally different, was completely forgetting about what made season 1 so great, as indeed this episode had the strongest season 1 feel to it. We touched on the Guilty Remnant again, and to be honest, when I first heard this episode would be bringing them back, I wasn't too thrilled because I thought their storyline played out as much as it needed to in season 1, and we didn't really need to see any more of them. But this episode actually made them interesting again, as it was about Lori and Tom setting up a group to try to deprogram people who fell into the Guilty Remnant, and it was so effective. It was so interesting to see Lori talking again, and as a reformed person who no longer believed in the GR and was fighting against them, and Tom was the inside man who would pretend to be in the GR in order to find people to recruit. This episode was quite slow at first, but I felt it was really effective in setting the stage and getting you to identify and feel for these characters. I don't know if that scene where Liv Tyler raped Tom was really necessary. It felt a bit weird, but I guess weird is par for the course for the Leftovers, but I felt it was a bit much. But I did like how the GR were established as meaning business in this episode, and they came off as much more of a straight up villains, more so than they did in season 1. It makes sense they would be more hostile towards people openly trying to mess with their group. But I like the storyline about the woman Tom turned from the GR and how Lori tried to help her live a normal life and go back to her family, and having the threat of the lure of the GR hanging over her. I was really afraid that she would simply go back to the GR, which I thought would be too predictable and would have been a tad cliched, but they totally subverted that by having her kill herself and her whole family in a car crash. I totally wasn't expecting that. But I did feel Lori actually attacking the publisher was a bit much. I did expect her to go off on him or something, but actually beating him up I thought was a bit overboard. I know she was really under stress after having heard of that woman just having a car crash with her family, but she shouldn't really be so sensitive about stuff that she put in her book. After all, it's in her book that she's trying to get published, so she should expect public scrutiny. Plus, I noticed there were a lot of vague references to Australia in this episode, mostly through the TV, where apparently some guy had come back from the dead or something like that. I don't know, I didn't quite catch it, but they also mentioned Australia because Kevin's father's moving there, so it made me wonder if they're setting up for season 3 to be them going to Australia. Who knows? So I wasn't too sure about this episode at first until the ending, where Tom tells the story about how he now has Wayne's power. That scene was amazing. So first off, I watched a review where the reviewers assumed he was lying because we never saw this happen in season 1. However, I had assumed that this had all happened off screen. They said it wouldn't fit because we knew where Wayne was, but that's not true. Tom was on the East Coast traveling east, and he said in his story that this was the day before Wayne died, and we saw Wayne die with Kevin somewhere in upstate New York, I assume. So it's not out of the realm of possibility that he's traveled from wherever Tom was to wherever Kevin was in a single day, them both being in the general northeast area. Plus, when Tom met Jill at the diner, he refused to hug her, so I think it would be more interesting if Tom's story was true. But who knows if he really does have Wayne's powers, or if Wayne's powers really ever existed in the first place. But it does add an awesome element to the show, and I'm really fascinated to see how they follow up on this. So my rating for Off Ramp is a 9 excellent. A much better episode than I thought it would be, that brought back that feeling of season 1, but still gave it an interesting twist that we never got before, and really upped the stakes for Tom and Laurie's characters, that I'm glad the show didn't forget about them. So finally, we come to episode 4, Orange Sticker, where we got back to the Garveys and the Murphys and Miracle to finally follow up on the cliffhanger of episode 1. We see Kevin having to deal with the threat of being held in suspicion for having something to do with the girl's disappearance and trying to piece together what happened. I love the opening where Nora thinks that the departure may have happened again because Kevin is suddenly missing when she thought he was right there, and the neighbors are missing their daughter, so this kind of hampers back to what the scientist said in episode 2 about the possibility of the departure happening again. So I loved how she was freaking out and couldn't get the TV or the internet going to find out if this was a worldwide thing again. But then she sees Kevin and is so relieved, but once that wears off, she's pissed at him for disappearing. I love how she never actually asks him about it and sort of just waits for him to bring it up, but he never does. And finally, Jill has to be the one to be like, "Where the hell were you?" It kind of frustrates me that he won't just tell her everything, because in episode 2 he was very upfront in telling her what happened with Patty and how he had no memory of it. I'm sure there's a reason the writers are doing it this way and it's setting up for something good, but in the meantime it's really frustrating because you know he could save himself a lot of heartache down the line if he just tells her what's going on, but it also makes sense that he'd be too afraid to do so. So let's talk about Patty. I watched some other reviews where they think, that Kevin's just a schizophrenic and she's just his subconscious talking to him, but I think it goes deeper than that. Getting back to season 1, you got the sense that his dad wasn't simply crazy and there was a lot more going on and that he was actually talking to someone. In fact, that scene in the finale where Kevin was having this dream of being locked in a mental institution was kind of passing the torch from father to son of hearing the voices, and in that dream they made it clear that Patty was the voices. I don't know, I think the writers meant to have this open to interpretation, but I get the sense that Kevin's father wasn't just crazy and something supernatural was going on, and now it's happening to Kevin. I don't know, that's just the sense I get. And what's also great to theorize in this episode is, did another departure happen? Michael certainly thinks that's the case and that his sister is just gone. His conversation with Jill on the matter was very interesting. And then Patty also seemed to indicate this to Kevin at the end of the episode when she said that the girls just vanished. I heard some other people speculating that when the lake drained of water, they just got sucked into a hole. That's what I first thought at the end of episode 1, but I no longer think that's the case, especially with all those search parties out there. I was thinking about the story Erica was telling Kevin about her children, how they were twins but born months apart, saying that this can happen sometimes. This made me think that maybe Miracle is just having a delayed reaction to the departure. Something about its geographical location caused it to have the departure several years later, and something about the earthquake set it off. However, if that was the case, you'd think more people would be missing than just the girls, but maybe that was just the beginning and there's more to come, and the girls just happen to be closer to the center of it. I don't know, it's just a theory, but it's something interesting to think about, and I'm really curious to see where they go from here. Also, I do have to talk about the ending scene where Kevin finally talks to Patty. That was so good. It was obvious he was trying to ignore her because he didn't want to become crazy like his dad, but he just had enough. And it was interesting what she said about his relationship with Nora. In this case, it kind of does seem like it's just his subconscious talking. And then the big bomb when she tells him he tried to kill himself. That's very interesting. If so, it would seem to imply he had nothing to do with the girl's disappearance and just happened to be in the same area. I'm curious to see if the other shoe will ever drop and if John will find out that Kevin was there when the girls disappeared, because if he does, ooh, that would be trouble. I don't know, but it's all really exciting. So my rating for Orange Sticker is an 8, extremely good. I didn't think this episode was quite as powerful as the first 3, but it was still a very interesting episode. It had some great moments such as the Patty confrontation and the possibility that the girls departed. I can't wait to see what they're going to go do next. So, my overall thoughts on the first 4 episodes is so far in Season 2 is shaping up to be much better than Season 1, in my opinion. It's a bit too early to tell, and Season 2 could end up getting worse, and the second half could be a disappointment, but so far I've been continually blown away by each episode and managed to far exceed whatever expectations I had for Season 2, and personally I think the show has greatly improved. So that's it for my review on The Leftovers Season 2 episodes 1 through 4. I'll be back here again after episode 7 airs to review episodes 5 through 7. And be sure to check out my channel for many other TV show reviews, and make sure you subscribe so you can keep up with all that. And thanks a lot for watching.